The Onyx Lounge didn't serve customers. It seduced them. Velvet curtains hung like heavy eyelids over booths that promised more secrets than cocktails. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent weight of deals made in the dark. Below the dim amber lights, the city's most dangerous predators gathered to trade blood for gold in a silence that felt like a held breath. Sasha Thorne moved through the smoke like a ghost in a white collar. Her waitress uniform was still crisp, though her spirit was frayed by the mounting weight of rent and the thorny reality of being an outsider in a city of wolves. She'd taken the double shift out of desperation, ignoring the rumors of who frequented the back corner booth. The manager's voice echoed in her head. Triple tips. Absolute silence. Never linger. Never look at their hands, especially not the ones covered in ink. But fate, Sasha would soon realize, had no respect for the hierarchy of monsters. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The silence that followed the spill was more deafening than the roar of the city outside. It was a vacuum, an abrupt death of sound that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the Onyx Lounge. Sasha Thorne stood frozen, the empty glass pot still trembling in her hand, watching as the dark, syrupy liquid soaked into the pristine white linen of the customer's sleeve. For a heartbeat, the only movement was the steam rising from the fabric, curling upward like a ghost against the man's tattooed neck. Jeegal Hwi didn't flinch. He didn't jerk his arm away or cry out from the heat. He simply stared at the stain, his expression as unreadable as a mountain. His hand, resting flat on the mahogany table, was covered in a sprawling landscape of black ink, delicate traditional waves and jagged mountain peaks that climbed up his wrist and disappeared under the ruined cuff. The silver watch on his wrist caught the amber light, ticking away the final seconds of Sasha's normal life. Then, the shadows moved. From the periphery of the lounge, 3 men materialized. They didn't run, they drifted forward with a terrifying, synchronized grace. These were the Horyong, the Grey Wolves. They wore dark charcoal suits that seemed to absorb the dim light, their faces devoid of mercy. One stepped to Sasha's left, another to her right, and the third stood directly behind her, his presence a cold weight against her spine. The air in the booth grew heavy, charged with the static of impending violence. I'm so sorry, Sasha whispered, her voice sounding thin and foreign to her own ears. She reached out instinctively with a silk napkin, her fingers shaking. Let me... A hand shot out, catching her wrist in a grip that felt like a band of cold iron. It was Jeegal. He didn't look at her at first. He looked at the place where his skin met hers. The contrast was stark, her deep, warm complexion against the pale, ink-stained map of his hand. He slowly tilted his head, his eyes finally meeting hers. They weren't the eyes of an angry customer. They were the eyes of a man who had just found something he didn't know he was looking for. White linen, Jeegal said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver of pure dread down Sasha's back. It's very difficult to get the bitterness out once it sinks in. The manager appeared then, hovering a safe distance away, his face the color of ash. Mr. Jeegal, please, we will handle this. She's new, she's mine, Jeegal interrupted, not breaking eye contact with Sasha. The Grey Wolves tightened their circle, their silent, looming presence cutting her off from the rest of the world. The thorny resilience that usually defined Sasha Thorne flickered, then flared. She didn't look down. She didn't beg. Even with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she met his gaze with a defiant spark. It was an accident, she said, her voice firmer now. Jeegal Hwi leaned forward, the smell of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. A thin, dangerous smile touched his lips. There are no accidents in my world, Sasha Thorne. Only debts. And you just incurred a very expensive one. He released her wrist, but the mark of his fingers remained, a phantom cuff of heat. The wolves didn't move. They waited for the alpha to decide how the collection would begin. The neighborhood was never truly quiet, but tonight, the usual symphony of distant sirens and barking dogs had been strangled into a heavy, artificial silence. Sasha sat in her cramped kitchen, the linoleum peeling beneath her feet, staring at the red welts on her wrist. The heat from Jeegal's grip had long since faded, yet the skin still pulsed as if his fingerprints were etched into her bone. She had tried to wash the smell of the Onyx Lounge from her hair, but the scent of sandalwood and spilled coffee seemed to have followed her home, clinging to the damp walls of her apartment. A sudden, rhythmic knock thudded against her door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a neighbor or the light tap of a friend. It was measured, heavy, and absolute. When Sasha pulled the door open, the hallway light died, swallowed by the broad shoulders of the men standing in the corridor. Two members of the Horyong stood like gargoyles flanking her entrance, their dark suits sharp enough to bleed the shadows. Between them stood Jeegal Hwi. He had changed his clothes, now wearing a charcoal overcoat that made him look like a part of the night itself. His eyes swept over her small, defiant space, the mismatched chairs, the flickering light bulb, the stack of overdue bills on the counter, with a clinical, predatory interest. "Mr. Jeegal," Sasha said, her voice catching before she forced her shoulders back, her thorny pride rising like a shield. "I told the manager I would pay for the dry cleaning. Just send me the bill." Jeegal stepped over the threshold without an invitation, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper, but he didn't hand it to her. He laid it flat on the scarred wooden table. It wasn't an invoice from a tailor. It was a printed photograph of Sasha leaving the lounge 3 weeks ago, followed by a detailed list of her mother's pharmacy records and her own bank statements. "The suit was worth more than this building," Jeegal said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the glass in the cabinets rattle. "But money is a boring way to settle a score. I don't want your penny, Sasha Thorne. I want your eyes." Sasha's heart skipped a jagged beat. "My eyes?" Jeegal leaned down, his face inches from hers. The intricate tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light. "My enemies think they know the Grey Wolves. They watch my men, my cars, my accounts. But they don't see the woman who blends into the smoke. They don't see the waitress who hears what is whispered when the music is too loud." He straightened, sliding a heavy silver fountain pen toward her. "You will work for me. Not in a bar and not for tips. You will be my ghost. Every secret you overhear, every hand you see slip under a table, belongs to me." "And if I refuse?" Sasha asked, her chin lifting even as her pulse thundered. Jeegal leaned back, the silver watch on his wrist catching the light. "Then the debt remains, and I am very creative about how I collect from those who have nothing left to lose." He didn't wait for her to sign. He knew the weight of the silence he left behind. As he turned to leave, the Grey Wolves stepped back into the shadows of the hall, leaving the contract on her table like a death warrant written in gold ink. Sasha looked at the pen, then at the door, realizing the lounge had been a sanctuary compared to the cage Jeegal Hwi had just built around her. The Horang estate was not a home. It was a fortress carved from obsidian and cold intention. Sasha moved through the grand dining hall of the den, her white waitress shirt replaced by a sleek black silk blouse that felt like a mourning shroud. The air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, the smell of a storm about to break. Around the long, lacquered table sat the alphas of the city's underworld, men whose faces were etched with the scars of 1,000 betrayals. They didn't speak in shouts. They spoke in whispers that carried the weight of death warrants. Jeegal Hwi sat at the head of the table, his charcoal jacket discarded, revealing the full, intricate map of his tattoos. In the harsh overhead light, the ink seemed to pulse with every movement of his muscles. He didn't look at Sasha as she moved behind him, but she felt his presence like a magnetic pull. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a silent recorder, her ears tuned to the subtext to every grunt and guarded glance. "The docks are leaking, Jeegal," one man rasped, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the wood. "The Grey Wolves are getting fat while we starve in the shadows." Sasha leaned in to refill his glass, her movements fluid and invisible. As she poured, her eyes caught a subtle movement beneath the table, a hand slipping a small encrypted drive into a pocket. It wasn't the man speaking, it was the consigliere sitting to his right, a man with a nervous tick in his left eye. She didn't linger. She moved to the next guest, her mind cataloging the interaction with the precision of a crime scene investigator. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a blade held at the throat of the night. Every time a knife scraped against a plate, the Horang guards standing against the walls shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their holsters. Sasha felt the thorny edge of her own fear, but she sharpened it into focus. She noticed the way the guest from the West District avoided drinking the water, and how Jeegal's silver watch caught the light every time he leaned forward to emphasize a point. As the meeting reached its fever pitch, Jeegal finally turned his head. His dark eyes caught hers for a fleeting second, a silent command to remember everything. In that look, Sasha realized she wasn't just a ghost in the room, she was the most dangerous weapon at the table. She carried the secrets of the wolves in the folds of her black silk, and for the first time, the debt felt less like a cage and more like a jagged piece of glass she was learning how to hold. When she finally stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen, her heart was thundering, not with terror, but with the cold, intoxicating thrill of the hunt.
The summit didn't end with a handshake, it ended with a draw. As the heavy mahogany chairs scraped against the floor, the tension that had been simmering for hours finally boiled over. The boss from the West District, a man named Park with a face like crumpled parchment and a reputation for explosive volatility, slammed his palm onto the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Instantly, the gray wolves and Park's own detail mirrored each other, a synchronized dance of hands reaching for concealed holsters and eyes narrowing into slits. Jeegal Hwi remained seated, his posture terrifyingly still. The only sign of his agitation was the slight tightening of the tattoos around his throat. "You're accusing me of theft in my own house, Park?" Jeegal's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "That is a debt that usually ends in a funeral." Park leaned over the table, his spit flying. "The shipment was intercepted. Your wolves were seen. Don't play the saint with me, Jeegal. I want my percentage, or I burn this district to the ground." Sasha, standing in the shadows with a tray of untouched crystal glasses, saw the moment the fuse was lit. She saw Jeegal's finger twitch, the subtle signal for his men to open fire. The air felt charged with a sudden, violent static. If she didn't move, the obsidian floor would be stained with more than just spilled coffee. She stepped out of the shadows, her footsteps deliberate and rhythmic on the polished floor. She didn't approach Jeegal, she approached Park. With a fluid grace that masked her thundering pulse, she placed a fresh glass in front of the volatile boss and began to pour a rare amber vintage. "It's a shame to let such a fine year go to waste over a misunderstanding of geography," Sasha said, her voice cutting through the silence with a thorny clarity. Park's head snapped toward her, his rage momentarily diverted by the sheer audacity of a waitress speaking. "What did you say, girl?" Sasha didn't blink. She kept pouring, the amber liquid swirling in the light. "I was at the Onyx Lounge the night that shipment moved. I heard the truckers talking about the fog in the East District, how they had to divert through the wolves' territory just to keep the cargo dry. They weren't intercepted, Mr. Park. They were sheltered, to keep your percentage from rotting in the rain." It was a lie, a brilliant, calculated gamble based on a weather report she'd seen on the news and the nervous tick she'd observed in Park's logistics officer earlier that night. Jeegal's eyes locked onto Sasha's. He saw the thorn she was planting, a way for Park to save face without admitting he was wrong. The silence stretched, agonizingly thin. Then Park slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the wine, then at Jeegal, the fire in his eyes fading into a wary suspicion. "Sheltered, was it?" Park grunted, reaching for the glass. "Jeegal is a man of ancient honor," Sasha added, stepping back into the gloom. Jeegal Hwi let out a slow, dark chuckle that broke the spell. The hands moved away from the holsters. The chrome and leather room breathed again. As the rival boss strained his glass, Jeegal watched Sasha disappear into the shadows. He had bought her for her eyes, but as the night cooled, he realized he had acquired a tongue that could disarm an army. The debt was still there, but the power dynamic had shifted. The waitress wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was the architect of his survival.
The aftermath of the summit left the estate in a state of clinical, chilling quiet. The rival bosses had retreated into the night, leaving behind the heavy scent of gunpowder and unsaid threats. Sasha found herself in the private library, a room of dark cedar and leather that seemed to absorb sound. Jeegal Hwi sat by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers dancing across the jagged mountains inked onto his skin. He didn't have his jacket on. He didn't even have his guard. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had been at war since the day he was born. "You have a dangerous habit of speaking when you should be invisible," Jeegal said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't look up, but but he gestured to the chair opposite him. Sasha didn't sit. Her thorny exterior remained intact, even as the adrenaline of the de-escalation began to ebb. Invisibility doesn't pay debts, Mr. Jeegal, and a dead employer is a bad investment. Jeegal finally looked at her, the firelight catching the silver of his watch. He reached up, his fingers tracing the thick, black lines that spiraled from his collarbone towards his jaw. People see these and they see a criminal. They see the devil of the Grey Wolves. But every line is a name. Every wave is a year I wasn't supposed to survive. He leaned forward, and for the first time, the predatory distance between them vanished. He pointed to a small, intricate symbol nestled near the base of his throat, a brilliant, stylized sun partially eclipsed by a mountain. Hwi, he whispered. My name means brilliance. My father gave it to me while we were hiding in the mountains of Gangwon, back when the Jeegal name was a mark for execution. The tattoos aren't for intimidation. They are for remembrance. They are the map of a family that was erased so I could stand in this room. Sasha looked at the ink, seeing the brilliance he spoke of, not in the wealth of the room, but in the sheer, stubborn will to exist. The tattoos weren't just decorative. They were a ledger of blood and survival, much like the scars she carried from the streets she'd climbed out of. She realized then that Jeegal Hwi wasn't a monster who loved the dark. He was a man who had built a kingdom in it because the light had tried to kill him. You're a map of a ghost story, Sasha said softly, her voice losing its defensive edge. Jeegal's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, but softened the harsh lines of his face. And you, Sasha Thorne, are the only person who has bothered to read the legend. He stood up, the height of him once again imposing, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer just about a debt or a coffee stain. It was about the recognition of two people who had survived by becoming exactly what the world feared most.
The transition from the quiet library to the cold reality of the docks happened in a heartbeat. Sasha was stationed in a glass-walled observation office overlooking the shipping containers. Her task simple: watch the hands of the longshoremen as they offloaded a private crate for the Horong. But the night air, usually heavy with the scent of salt and diesel, suddenly soured with the smell of scorched metal. A sharp, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack shattered the glass of the office window. Sasha dove for the floor, the thorny resilience of her spirit replaced by a cold, visceral instinct to survive. Shards of safety glass rained down on her like a diamond storm. Outside, the crane lights were snuffed out by a hail of gunfire, plunging the wharf into a strobe-lit nightmare. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a negotiation. It was an execution. A rival faction had tracked the ghost to the source. Sasha, stay down. The voice crackled over the comms unit in her ear. It was Jeegal, but his usual melodic rasp was replaced by a jagged, lethal urgency. Through the gaps in the office furniture, Sasha saw them, the Grey Wolves. They moved across the shipyard not as bodyguards, but as a predatory pack. They didn't retreat. They flowed into the crossfire, their suppressed weapons spitting fire in short, disciplined bursts. In the center of the chaos, Jeegal Hwi moved with a terrifying brilliance. He didn't hide. He stood behind a shipping crate, his silver watch reflecting the muzzle flashes as he directed his men with the precision of a conductor. The office door was kicked open, the hinges screaming. Sasha curled into a ball, expecting the end, but a heavy tactical vest shielded her. It was the lead guard of the Wolves, his face a mask of sweat and gunpowder. The boss wants you out, now. They moved through a tunnel of lead. Sasha felt the heat of bullets passing inches from her skin, the air vibrating with the force of the engagement. As they reached the armored SUV, the door swung open to reveal Jeegal. He grabbed her by the collar of her black blouse, hauling her into the leather-scented sanctuary of the vehicle. His hand was wet. Sasha looked down, her breath hitching as she saw the dark crimson staining his white cuff. Real blood, not coffee. He didn't look at his wound, he looked at her, his thumb tracing a shallow cut on her cheek from the flying glass. A debt of blood is the only one that can't be cleared with a signature, Sasha Thorne, he rasped, the vehicle lurching forward as the Grey Wolves formed a protective perimeter of steel around them. You've seen the wolf bleed, now you'll see how we hunt. The ghost had finally been touched by the shadows. As the SUV sped away from the burning docks, Sasha realized the ink on Tiefel's neck wasn't just a map of the past. It was an invitation to a future where she was no longer an observer, but a casualty of the very brilliance she had admired.
The sanctuary of the Horang estate felt like a pressurized chamber in the wake of the dock's ambush. Jeegal Hwi sat in his command center, a room dominated by a wall of high-definition monitors displaying thermal feeds, encrypted ledgers, and biometric scans. His security team, the most expensive in Seoul,
combed through the digital ghost of the attack, looking for a breach in the firewall or a leaked GPS ping. They found nothing. To the software, the ambush was an impossibility, a glitch in a perfect system. Sasha stood at the back of the room, her thorny gaze fixed not on the screens, but on the men standing beneath them. She had learned that technology only sees what it is programmed to look for, but a waitress sees the things people do when they think they are part of the scenery. She watched the gray wolves, the elite pack that had just bled for their alpha. Her eyes settled on Minho, a senior guard with a decade of service and a flawless record. To the biometric scanners, his heart rate was steady, his pupils dilated only by the dim light. But Sasha saw the way his left hand hovered near his ear. Not to check his comms, but a nervous, repetitive stroke of the lobe, a gesture she'd seen him make only once before, the night he'd lost a heavy hand at the underground baccarat tables in the West District. "Mr. Jeegal," Sasha said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. The security chief glared at her, but Jeegal raised a hand, silencing the room. "Speak, Ghost," Jeegal rasped, his injured arm resting in a black silk sling. "Your tech is looking for a digital signature," Sasha said, walking towards the monitors. "But betrayal doesn't always leave a code. It leaves a scent." She pointed directly at Minho. "The night of the summit, he didn't drink the tea I served. He swapped his cup with the West District's concierge, a silent salute. And just now, when you mentioned the lost cargo, he didn't look at the screen, he looked at the exit." The room turned into a vacuum. Minho's hand dropped from his ear, his fingers inching towards his holster. But Jeegal was faster. He didn't even stand. He simply tilted his head, and two other wolves had their weapons leveled at Minho's temple before he could clear leather. Jeegal stood slowly, the brilliance in his eyes turning into a cold, blinding white. He walked towards the traitor, his footsteps heavy with the weight of a death sentence. He didn't look at the man, he looked at Sasha. "The high-tech sensors missed the pulse," Jeegal whispered, his voice a jagged edge of respect. But the girl who was once invisible saw the lie. He turned back to Minho, his face a mask of ancient stone. "Sasha Thorne just paid another installment on her debt. But yours, Minho, yours is due in full." As the gray wolves dragged the traitor into the soundproof depths of the basement, Sasha felt a cold shiver. She had saved the pack, but in doing so, she had become the most essential gear in Jeegal's machine. The invisible maid was gone. She was now the one who saw the rot before it could bloom. The Golden Gate was not a bridge, but a sprawling, decommissioned refinery on the edge of the Han River, its rusted skeletal towers glowing like jagged teeth under the crimson flare of the city's industrial lights. This was the seat of the West District's power, the place where Park had gathered his remaining forces for a final, desperate stand. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and old oil, a suffocating heat that made Sasha's black silk shirt cling to her skin like a second layer of defense. "Stay behind the armor," Jeegal rasped, his voice barely audible over the low, rhythmic thrum of the idling SUVs. He checked the action on his custom firearm, the silver watch on his wrist catching the strobe of the refinery's flickering safety lights. "This isn't a bar, Sasha. There are no words left to save us." But Sasha Thorne didn't stay behind the steel. Her thorny resilience had evolved into something sharper, a tactical necessity. She had seen the blueprints Min T's counterpart had missed. She knew that the refinery's pressure valves were the only thing keeping the entire structure from becoming a pyre. As the gray wolves surged forward, the night exploded into a symphony of fire and lead. Muzzle flashes illuminated the maze of pipes as Park's men fought with the ferocity of cornered rats. Sasha moved through the chaos, not with a gun, but with the voyeur's precision she had mastered. While the wolves provided the thunder, she sought the lightning. She bypassed the main firefight, slipping through a narrow service catwalk that groaned under her weight. Below her, she saw Jeegal pinned down behind a stack of chemical drums, his ink-stained neck visible in the flare of a nearby explosion. Park was closing in from a high-angle gantry, his weapon leveled for a killing blow. Sasha didn't hesitate. She reached the manual override for the steam vent located directly above Park's position. With a scream of effort, she wrenched the rusted wheel clockwise. The pipes shrieked in protest before a massive, blinding plume of superheated steam erupted, engulfed the gantry, and sent Park's aim wide. The distraction was all the brilliance Jeegal needed. He surged for cover, his movements a blur of lethal grace as he neutralized the threat. In the silence that followed the final echoes of gunfire, the refinery began to burn, the Golden Gate lighting up the river in a funeral pyre for the West District. Jeegal stood amidst the smoke, his chest heaving, looking up at the catwalk where Sasha stood silhouetted against the flames. She wasn't a ghost anymore, and she wasn't a debt to be collected. She was the one holding the valve to his life. As the gray wolves secured the perimeter, Jeegal didn't call for his medics. He simply held out a hand to her, acknowledging that the waitress from the Onyx Lounge had officially burned down the old world to build a new one by his side.
The morning after the fire at the Golden Gate, the Onyx Lounge was a tomb of silent velvet and dust. The sun bled through the high, narrow windows, illuminating the motes of ash that still clung to Sasha's hair. She sat in the same back booth where it had all begun, her white waitress shirt long since discarded for the heavy, blood-stained black silk of the Hwi rang. Across from her, Jeegal Hwi looked different in the daylight. The brilliance of his name was no longer a threat. It was a tired, human exhaustion that lined his face. On the mahogany table sat the paper contract from her apartment, the one that had turned a coffee spill into a life sentence. It was wrinkled, scorched at the edges by the refinery fire. Jeegal didn't say a word as he reached out with his tattooed hand, his fingers tracing the thorn in her signature one last time. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the paper down the middle. He shredded the fragments until they were nothing but white confetti on the dark wood. "The debt is gone, Sasha," Jeegal rasped, his voice sounding like gravel over silk. He slid a thick, unmarked envelope across the table, enough money to pay her mother's bills 10 times over and buy a life far away from the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder. "The gray wolves are moving to the southern docks. You've seen enough of the dark. Go back to the light." Sasha looked at the money, then at the door of the lounge where the world she used to know waited. The mundane shifts, the ignored apologies, the safety of being invisible. Then she looked at the ink on Jeegal's neck, the map of a man who had finally met someone who could read him. Her thorny pride didn't want the exit. It wanted the loyalty she had found in the fire. "You're wrong, Jeegal," Sasha said, her voice steady and resonant in the empty lounge. She pushed the envelope back toward him. "I didn't survive that refinery to go back to pouring coffee for men who don't see me. You bought my eyes, but you gave me a seat at the table." Jeegal's eyes narrowed, a flicker of the old predator returning. "This life doesn't have a retirement plan, Sasha. You'll be a target until the day you stop breathing. Then I'll be the one who sees them coming," she countered, her chin lifting. "The wolves need a ghost who knows how to handle the light, and you need someone who isn't afraid to spill a little ink when the world gets too clean." Jeegal stared at her for a long, heavy minute. Then a slow, genuine smile broke across his face, the first one that reached his eyes. He stood up, the silver watch on his wrist catching the morning sun, and held out his hand. Not as a master and not as a creditor, but as a partner. Sasha took it, her warm palm pressing against the jagged mountains of his ink. The debt was paid in full, but the alliance was just beginning. As they walked out of the Onyx Lounge and into the waiting armored car, the waitress was gone. The protector of the pack had arrived.